Hi, welcome to another episode of About the Authors TV. I'm your host, Jake Brown. Just in case you haven't heard of Fawn Weaver, Time Magazine is happy to introduce you to her as CEO of Uncle Nearest Inc., one of only 5 African American women in U.S. history to found and lead a billion-dollar-plus company, while importantly noting that many contributions of enslaved men and women have only just started to be recognized, and Weaver has made sure at least one critical piece of the history is not forgotten. Speaking specifically, as Essence Magazine elaborates, of the taste of Uncle Nearest, which whiskey lovers have come to know and love, with products in more than 45,000 stores, hotels, bars, and restaurants around the globe. The premium whiskey, launched by CEO Fawn Weaver, reached an evaluation of more than $1 billion in 2022, according to the reports. However, the true story of its namesake inspiration is still unknown to many. Since the whiskey company's inception in 2016, Weaver's been the loudest voice, spreading the story of the real Nathan Nearest Green, the enslaved man responsible for teaching Jack Daniel how to make the whiskey that will become the famous flavor of Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey. Now Weaver's taking her efforts to share Green's history and importance even further with the release of her new book, Love and Whiskey, the remarkable true story of Jack Daniel, his master distiller Nearest Green, and the improbable rise of Uncle Nearest. Measuring the success of both the author and her book-inspired business, Forbes recently brought their review of her one-of-a-kind story full circle, as Weaver made history in real time as she was sharing it on the page, reporting that Uncle Nearest Premium Whiskey is the fastest-growing American whiskey brand in U.S. history, the best-selling African-American founded spirit brand of all time, and was the most award-winning American whiskey, including bourbon, of 2019, 2020, and 2021. And by 2024, its sales had tripled, becoming the best-selling black-founded and led spirit of all time, earning Weaver a spot on Forbes' annual list of America's richest self-made women for the first time. And she joins us today to talk all about her one-of-a-kind success story as an author, entrepreneur, and whiskey distiller. Fawn, welcome to the show. When you travel back to childhood, what sorts of stories do you most remember capturing your imagination?
I've always loved to read, but the irony is I've never enjoyed fiction. So I've always been a nonfiction reader. And when I was young in school, I'd get in trouble because they'd give these novels for the kids to read, and I would refuse to read them because my family had the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is a big deal for an African-American family in in the 80s, early 80s at that. And so the teacher wanted me to read stories that were made up. And I said, why would I do that? I can literally flip to any page and learn something amazing. And so I've always been a lover of nonfiction. I've always been a very intentional learner, not because I was trying to learn, but just because I really enjoyed learning. And I've been that way for as long as I can remember. I've been that way.
Now, you have an incredible life story that itself could be the subject of a book. Leaving home at 15, founding your first public relations firm at 19 with Few Entertainment, which involves storytelling and forms fashioned to each specific client's marketing campaigns. We'd be grateful for any reflections you'd share on this fascinating background and any mentors you care to spotlight along the way to your success with Grant Sydney Inc. and beyond.
Most people have mentors that they've had along the way. They have people that they look at and say, those people inspired me. Everything I've ever had has been in a book. From the time I was very young, everything has been books. And so I would learn about other people and I would learn about their journeys. And that has just always been my joy to this day. At one point, my husband put me on a book buying moratorium. This was probably about 15 years ago. And he said, every closet in our house is being utilized for your books. We don't have any space for closet. People come over, we don't have a coat closet. It's your books. And so he said to me, he said, you cannot buy any additional books until you've read all the ones you have. So I went on an absolute binge, an absolute tear to read through every book so that I could go back to buying more books. So that is, I don't know why that's the case, but I've learned so much from America's Titans. I've learned so much from even tyrants of the world and understanding how in the world do they get people to believe their god-awful stuff and all the propaganda and things of that nature? Because I think it's important for us to understand how that stuff happened. Otherwise, we run the risk of it happening again. But every single mentor would, I mean, if you go back, then I would say, maybe JD Rockefeller, maybe Carnegie, maybe Ben Franklin, maybe. So if you go back to the original titans that we still see on the side of buildings, the Schwabs of the world, the JP Morgans of the world, I've studied them to understand how do things like this get done. And most people assume that all of those people came from money. Most assume that they were educated. Henry Ford literally did not have a formal education, not even elementary school. And so I think we put a really high value on formal education here, where if someone wanted to learn how to be the best stock trader in the world, they could just read everything that Warren Buffett has ever written. Every interview he's ever done, he has shared every secret that he has. There are no secrets of how Warren Buffett does what he does because he shared it all. We're just lazy. Don't take the time to read it. I left home when I was 15. And so a lot of what I learned really truly has been through books. And when I started my first company, I think it may have had even more to do with the fact that I didn't have a high school diploma. And I also didn't want to lie about it. And so it was a lot easier to establish my own business and to do what came natural to me. So I was also an intern. How I got my first 2 clients was interning for a PR firm. And I discovered that the way that I viewed things for PR was different. It's the way I storytell even to this day. It came natural where I looked at it and said, listen, y'all are sending out these press releases, but nobody wants to report on this stuff. I mean, why? Why is it the press's job to report on someone's product? That isn't their role. And so I understood very early on, their role is to get as many viewers, listeners, as many, readers as possible. And so I looked at it as my job to figure out how to deliver stories that would help them to do that. And so it was just a very different approach to PR. And a lot of the things that I did, we would now refer to as product integration. That wasn't really a thing in the early 90s, but it made sense to me. Don't try to bring the press to you, go to where the press is already going to be and build something out around that. And so I wish I could say I learned that from someone, but I didn't, because even the PR maven that I was interning for, she was one of the best that LA has ever had. And even when I shared with her what my ideas were in terms of how to generate PR for her clients that she wasn't able to up until that point, she still didn't understand what I was saying. But she said, listen, I don't get it. I don't know why the press would, go for this. But if the clients say yes and you want to try it, we're not getting them press anyway, so why not? And so I was able to try to implement my ideas, and they worked.
When you did sit down to write your first best-selling book, we understand the idea sprang organically from a blog you started titled HappyWivesClub.com, where readers related so thoroughly to your messages that your readership grew to over 400,000 women in 100 countries around the world. Please talk about what inspiration and research culminated in the writing of Happy Wives Club, one woman's worldwide search for the secrets of a great marriage, which debuted at number 3 on the New York Times best-selling nonfiction paperback list upon release.
You've talked about this particular book before, which is Napoleon Hill's Think and Grow Rich, right? It's one of the most, to this day, one of the most purchased, one of the most listened to books, and it's 100 years old. And the thing that so many people miss in the book is he actually shares, yes, he shares how so many of these early American titans built their companies, the mistakes they made, but really what he's looking for, and it's what Carnegie hired him to do, was interview all these people and basically find the common denominators. What is it that creates success in a person's life and business? And what most people miss when they're reading that book, because it's only about a line, is that Napoleon Hill says of all of the things that he studied and learned and now understands, that the number one indicator as to whether a person will succeed or fail in business is the life partner they chose. And so people like to have this thing in buckets where it's business success, life success, it's marriage over here, and it's the office over here. And the reality is when you look at the most successful people that we have ever seen in our country, they have all had some woman there at the very beginning that has raised them up to new heights. So even when you have someone like a Jeff Bezos, who's gone through a very public divorce, but he's done that after he's the wealthiest man in the world, that leading up to that from the very beginning, his wife was there. You talk about Bill Gates, same thing. You can kind of go through all of the people that we have seen to achieve an enormous amount of success. Warren Buffett, they chose great life partners. Now, whether or not, success messed things up for them and they went separate ways, but it doesn't change the foundation. It's who they chose. And so when I am looking at success in business, I can't tell that story without dealing with choosing the right life partner. And so for me, when I was looking at marriage, at that point, I was 10 years into marriage when I put that book out. And I'm a very strong woman, incredibly strong woman. My husband and I, very different personalities. We have a lot of similarities, but we have a lot of things that are very different. And I wanted to understand, I don't want to just build with this person. I want to be happy as I build with this person. I want to be able to spend the rest of my life with this person. And I wasn't going to look for books that existed in order to do that. And the reason is all the books, whether it's Men Are From Mars or the other ones that you've interviewed over the years, it really is just about how to make it work. But I didn't want it to just work. I wanted to be happily married. And so that book hadn't been written. And so the question was, how do you write that book? Who gets to write that book? And so even the advice that is in there are 12 common denominators among marriages around the world that I could point to one in India and it mirrored one in Australia. I can point to it, it mirrored what they were doing in a happily married in the Philippines. And so I traveled the world and I interviewed couples happily married 25 years or more to deduce the common denominators. I was only looking for one. There ended up being 12.
Many would argue you traveled into even bolder territory in writing its follow-up, The Argument-Free Marriage, 28 Days to Creating the Marriage You've Always Wanted with the Spouse You Already Have. Please pull the curtain back on how you arrived at this magical blueprint for happiness that specifically utilizes conflict management as a compass of sorts to navigating a successful married life.
I wasn't trying to have an argument-free marriage. That was never my goal. I didn't think that something like that existed. But then when my little sister was getting married, Keith and I had been married, I want to say 5 years at that point. And they wanted to know why we had such a peaceful marriage. And truly, he nor I had ever even put thought to it. He and I both had such an enormous amount of respect for one another that our conversations were respectful. If people were actually to take the time and think about the people in their life or the person in their life who they absolutely respect and admire the most, could they ever see themselves in an actual argument with that person? So if the answer is no to that question, which it is, if the answer is no to that question, then why would you argue with the person who you have committed to spending the rest of your life with? Like, why wouldn't you use the same level of patience and grace that you give to that person? Why would you not give that to the person who has committed to be with you through good and bad, rich and poor, till death do you part? I don't care who this person is that you respect more than anyone else in the world. They haven't made that commitment to you. And so what I decided, and my husband decided, is that we were going to treat each other like we would treat the person who we respect most in life. And in doing that, arguments just didn't happen. Does that mean that disagreements did not happen? Oh, we're very different people. Absolutely. But how you actually go into the conversations, like you and your spouse could have a conversation 3 weeks from now on the exact same topic that has you fired up right at this very moment. But if you paused and actually prayed about it and took the time to calm down and let patience move forward, let grace move forward, it doesn't mean the issue doesn't get resolved. It does. It just gets resolved in a manner that's helpful for everyone and resolved in a manner that you're not having to go back and apologize for and trying to, I think that I had someone tell me this story one day, and I thought it was really great about, every time people say words that harms their spouse, it's like putting a nail in a fence, right? And so you have a whole backyard and you have this fence and it's nails, 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 nails. Well, you can go out there and you can pull out all those nails, but now you've left holes. And so Keith and I just really had a commitment that we were going to treat each other like the people who we respect and admired the most. That was it. And Keith said something to me very early on when he had done something, and this early in our marriage, and he had done something that had really hurt my feelings. I responded and let him know it hurt my feelings. And he said two words that I think changed everything, which was presume innocence. He said, presume that even if I said it in a way that hurt you, I love you so much. That was not my intention. So when you begin with a basis of presuming innocence, now all of a sudden you can have the conversation and say, you know what? He wasn't trying to hurt me. My worldview caused me to see what he was doing or to hear what he was saying in a manner that was different than his worldview understood. And that's it. We give each other grace for having had two very different worldviews growing up and knowing that that does in fact shape who we are and how we speak and what we do. And so for me, it wasn't trying to convince people that they should have an argument-free marriage. For a lot of people, that spice is like, the spice of life. They enjoy the back and forth. The way that I'm wired, I don't. I have my beliefs, I have my views, but I also respect others. I understand that their worldview shapes who they are. And the best way that I can explain it, the way that I view and the reason why I'm able to give that kind of grace is I think about my own faith. I am a Christian. I am a follower of Christ. Well, when I think about the story of Christ being born of a virgin, you have the story of Mary, and she comes and her friend is pregnant with John the Baptist, and Jesus in her belly leaps for joy, knowing that John the Baptist is right next to him. And then she gives birth and he's in a manger and yada, yada, yada. Now, we don't see him from the time he's in the temple and he tells his mother, woman, don't you know I'm about my father's business? And then we don't see or hear from him again until he's 30 years old. and he had 3 years of ministry. Then he dies. He's resurrected. He comes back. All the rest of that stuff. Okay, so hard stop when we listen to that story. If you didn't grow up with that worldview, it's the most ridiculous story you've ever heard. Absolutely absurd. But because you grew up with that as the basis of your worldview and everything is somehow connected to that, then you would be really, really hard pressed to get me to believe that that story is not 100% true, right? All right, so now come to the South, where people were taught by their parents, their grandparents, their teachers, that the Civil War was about Northern aggression. Again, you can look at it and say, well, you can get all these books that will tell you what it was really about. But if that was a part of your indoctrination when you were a child, and that's what you have known, all the books in the world are not going to change that view. And so because I understand this about my own faith and Christianity and how absurd that is from the outside, and I could find thousands of books that dissect what I believe. But those books don't hold weight to me. My personal relationship with this story does. Same is the case with other people who have different political worldviews. And I honor that.
Now, your next literary chapter would really read like no other has before in book or business history, as you quite literally made your own while exploring that of Nearest Green, with Forbes offering of this impressive origin story that Fawn Weaver isn't the type to back down from a challenge or destined opportunity. Weaver's been a serial entrepreneur for 25 years, but is a storyteller at her core, which led her to create Uncle Nearest Premium Whiskey in 2016. While traveling abroad in Singapore with her husband, she saw a photo of Jack Daniel and George Green, the son of a previously unknown master whiskey distiller. Uncle Nearest was a formerly enslaved man who taught Jack Daniel how to make Tennessee whiskey. After learning about Uncle Nearest and Jack Daniel's interconnected history, Weaver followed the story down to Tennessee, where Nearest taught Jack how to distill. Without any experience in distilling, she decided to open the Nearest Green Distillery in Shelbyville, Tennessee. Wow. We'll get to how successful your billion-dollar liquor brand has become in a bit, but would first love if you'd give viewers a tour back through this incredible turn in your own life story as you began learning more and more about the untold one of the most successful African-American distiller ever.
When I put out Happy Wives Club, I remember the Los Angeles Times reporter, journalist who was writing on the story. She said to me, she said, "This story, this book, you writing this, it makes sense because you're a rebel." And I hadn't really thought about that. She said, because society is saying that marriages can't be great, they can't be happy over long term. Once you get past the honeymoon phase, it's the ball and chains. Because that's what society is saying, the rebellious side of you decided to show society there is another side. I think that that's what drew me to this story, is that when the story first came out, headline in the New York Times was Jack Daniels embraces a hidden ingredient, help from a slave. Then you have this photo of Jack Daniel with a Black man seated to his right. Within hours, the internet, social media specifically, made the determination that Jack Daniel was a slave owner. He hid the recipe. He hid the slave. He stole the recipe. And I'm looking at this photo and saying, okay, this is written at early 20th century, late 19th century. This photo is taken around that time. If you wanted to hide a Black man at that time, you didn't put him in the photo. And so there's this whole narrative going on online that is very negative toward Jack Daniel and making this story. This is another thing that America has stolen from Black people, and this is his recipe, and all of this stuff happened within hours with no proof. And I'm looking at this photo and going, the only shred of proof we have as of right now is that Jack Daniel decided to stick a Black man next to him in the only known photo he has ever taken with other people, ever. And then when I got the actual photo, which is the full, not the cropped version that the New York Times used or the cropped version that I used on the front of Love and Whiskey. I start Love and Whiskey, I start the book off with the full photo so that people can see he didn't just have the Black man to his right. He actually ceded the center position of the entire photo to the Black man. And then when you start doing the research of Jack, you learn that at the time this photo was taken, his right leg was fully amputated. Everyone else in that photo is seated. Jack is standing, and he's standing with what would have to have been a cane, but we can't see it because he's using George Green, who we now know to be the African-American in the photo, Nearest Green's son. He's using George and his nephew, Lim Motlow, to cover the fact that he has no leg. And so I assumed very early on that this was a beautiful story. And I began looking at it from that lens. And the most amazing thing happens when you look at something from the lens of presumed innocence. Sometimes you'll be really surprised at what you find. And in this instance, I did the same thing as I do in my marriage. I presumed innocence. And I found that this is one of the greatest American stories that had never been written.
Now, as you set out on your quest to begin telling it fully and truly, Essence Magazine chronicled a dedication to research like no other, as you went so far as to buy the 300-acre farm in Lynchburg, Tennessee, where Green had lived and worked, gathering accounts of Green and Daniel's family, friends, and historical records, as you detailed the life and work of Nearest Green, who as a free man was the first master distiller for the Jack Daniel's whiskey brand and the first Black master distiller in the world. But more than just a tale of the phenomenal whiskey producer, Weaver's book shares the story of a dynamic friendship between people in different circumstances during a time of incessant racial turbulence in American history. Weaver credits Green and Daniel's living descendants, the oldest being 106 and 102 years old respectively, when she interviewed them for helping to piece together the story of the whiskey makers' relationship. It was their memories that helped her realize how diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives were at the core of Daniel's whiskey brand, long before such phrases as DEI were ever coined. Please talk about the powerful connection you felt to this sacred ground as you first walked it that then motivated you to want to buy it personally, and how the distillery itself became a character in the course of writing Love and Whiskey, the remarkable true story of Jack Daniel, his master distiller Nearest Green, and the improbable rise of Uncle Nearest, which ABC News admired for your ultimate success in documenting a vast history that was largely untapped until now.
In that same New York Times piece, there was a very large photo of a man by the name of Claude Eady. He was 91 years old at the time, African-American man. And underneath the photo, it said descendant of Nearest Green. But if you actually took the time to read the article, which I'm fully convinced that most of the people who commented on the headline in the photo had not actually read the article itself. But if you actually read the article, they asked him how he's related, and he said, I don't know. My mama just told me I was kin. Now, I've now done the research. He's not related by blood, but that's neither here nor there. At the time, it was the only lead I had on Nearest Green's family. And so I just went on Google and put in Claude Eady, Lynchburg, Tennessee, because most older people don't realize that the white pages became Google. And so immediately his home number and his address popped up. And so I called him and I said, is this the Claude Eady on Main Street? And he said, yes. And so I shared with him what it was that I was doing. And I said, I would like to come down in 2 weeks and I'd love to interview you if you'd be open to it. And his response was, I don't know if I'll still be here in 2 weeks, but if I'm still here, you can interview me. And so really going into that community, I was going in to meet one person, but I knew that one person would lead me to all the other people that I needed to talk to. And it was just a matter of, I was coming in with the right heart. And it wasn't going to be hard, I didn't believe, for people to recognize very quickly that I was coming in with the right heart. And that's precisely what happened. Claude Eady's wife, Miss Dot, by the time I finished that interview, we got to the end of it, and she said to me with tears in her eyes, she says, I don't know why I need to tell you this, but I'm so proud of you. This is a woman that I had never met. And she said that to me like I was her own granddaughter. And so that's really where I thought it would begin, but ironically, it's not where it began. When I got to Lynchburg, Tennessee to interview him, I started off at the library. And I was there for a matter of a couple of hours before Jack Daniel's second eldest descendant walks through the door. And by the time she and I finished having a conversation, she gave me the name and number of Nearest Green's descendant who had been doing genealogy on that family and every African-American family in Lynchburg for 30 years. Talk about an amazing place to start a project like this, is someone had essentially been working on it for 30 years.
Now, did you have letters or journals that Jack kept to draw from in the course of capturing the friendship between he and Nearest Green?
There were, but not any that would, it was really, his sister wrote a lot of diaries, but there wasn't a whole lot to go off of. The way that we were able to really piece together that legacy is that so many of the family members were still alive over the age of 90. A lot of them. Nearest's granddaughter, when I arrived, was 100, and when I met her for the first time, was 106 years old. She lived until 108. When I met Jack's eldest descendant, the very first time, she was 102. She passed away at 104. So what in a situation where you have oral history that's been passed down from generation to generation, you begin with the oral of those who are the eldest. And then you begin to piece things together based on photos. So we go back to the photo of George Green. There would be no reason in the world for Jack, in the only photo that he ever took with other people, to cede the center position to a Black man unless there was such an enormous amount of respect for that person that Jack wanted to make sure that his legacy, his father's legacy, would never be forgotten. You don't take that photo unless that is your desire. When it comes to, it's a process called the Lincoln County process. It is the single thing that distinguishes traditional bourbon that's made in Kentucky from the bourbon that is made here called Tennessee whiskey. There's only one distinguishment. Both are bourbons by legal definition, but Tennessee requires an additional step, which is taking traditional bourbon distillate, running it through sugar maple charcoal before it goes into the barrel to remove additional impurities. Well, Jack's family made sure on multiple occasions in the press to be very clear that that process came in with the enslaved people. There's a massive level of respect in doing that, because what we have seen in Kentucky is the people up there took credit for it. And down here, they said, nope, this is who brought it in. And so you have to look at something like that and work your way backwards. And that's what I did.
Amid your brilliant bursts of inspiration as this project came to life, one would make you the first African American billionaire whiskey company owner after the New York Times spotlighted a smart strategy where Weaver didn't want to use grain to promote whiskey. Rather, she wanted to use whiskey to promote green. And the idea that enslaved black people were also part of the story. A journey that began when, as Inc. magazine profiled, you made it your mission to bring his contributions to light, cementing Green's legacy. When, as the Harvard Business Review chronicled, as every major entrepreneurial periodical lined up to cover the stories that evolved in real time, that in 2017, Fawn Weaver launched a premium American whiskey brand, Uncle Nearest. It became the fastest growing and most awarded whiskey brand in America, despite the challenges Weaver faced as a black woman and outsider to the spirits industry, which is capital intensive, highly regulated, competitive, and male dominated. And after topping $1 billion in sales in the early 2020s, in October 2023, Weaver announced plans to expand into cognac with the goal of building the next major alcoholic beverages conglomerate. Going back to the root of all the success, could you give viewers a sense of what at heart makes this whiskey stand out so uniquely from the crowd, so to speak?
What happened was the realtor, who was Jack's descendant, who took us to the farm that we purchased, as we were in escrow and as I was beginning to talk to people in the community, everyone, I mean, people learned very quickly when we bought it. It was in the newspaper. That's what happens in small towns. And you very, very early on, she said, you know, if you decide to put his name on a bottle, I will come out of retirement to make sure you get it right. And as it turns out, that realtor, that was her second job in life. Her first one was 31 years in the family business at Jack Daniel Distillery. And when she retired from there, she retired as the head of whiskey operation. And so that was one piece of it. Then in talking to Nearest's family, it was very clear that they believed that his name should be on its own bottle, that he deserved that. Now, there were people within the family who thought, well, Jack Daniels should be the one to do it. And then there are people in the family who believed Jack Daniels doesn't deserve to be able to do that because they had all of these years to do it and they never did it until this woman came along. And so you had both sides, but you did have a consensus that he should have his own bottle. And so bringing all those things together, it just made sense. The other reason it made sense is that my goal, and I really felt this and I still do, is to cement the legacy of Nearest Green. That means making his name ubiquitous around the world. You can't do that with a film. You can't do that with a book. I don't care how popular the film is. And the example I always use, because it's consistent, is Hidden Figures. The entire country went to see Hidden Figures. We all cheered and shouted and you know, we were so proud of that legacy and that story. But if I were to ask, you might, because you're a writer, so you might dig into this, but I can be in a room with 1,000 people, which I've done this before, and ask the room, what are the names of the women who were the hidden figures that Octavia Spencer, Janelle Monáe, and Taraji P. Henson played? Nobody can tell you. And so we all went into that movie knowing 3 characters. We all left the movie knowing the same 3. So those hidden figures remain hidden. The core of it is, especially the core of bourbon, because it's so highly regulated, and Tennessee whiskey is a straight bourbon whiskey. It's even more regulated than bourbon is by itself. Nearest Green is the first known African-American master distiller. He is the teacher of Jack Daniel. He is the mentor of Jack Daniel. And he is the only known master distiller for distillery number 7, something that the company, Jack Daniels, didn't know really until I began doing my research that distillery number 7 ever existed. And what happened the first day that I was there in Lynchburg and I was in that library is not only did Jack's descendant give me the name and number of the woman who had been Nearest's descendant that had been doing genealogy for 30 years, but she also told us that the book that we had read, Jack Daniel's Legacy, his biography, a good portion of it takes place on a farm where Nearest Green and Jack both worked for the same man, a preacher and distiller by the name of Dan Call. They both worked for him in the mid 1850s and continued to be on that property until at least 1874. Now, that property is where Jack Daniel Distillery began. It is where distillery number 7 was. It's where the water that was used in every bottle of Jack, that water still runs through that spring the same way today as it did when Nearest was making the whiskey. Well, she says while in that library, she says, you realize that property is for sale. Well, of course not. Had no idea. And within the next day, I get a phone call from her cousin, who's a realtor, who offers to take us to that property. So long story short, we bought the property. And we now then owned the home where Jack grew up, where the entire second floor was a time capsule. The prior owners were afraid that their daughter would fall out of the second floor balcony, and so they closed off the entire second floor. So the girls' bedroom upstairs, we used to use newspaper as insulation. And then we had hand-painted wallpaper. That is what you did back then. Well, the wallpaper in many of the areas had already peeled down, and the newspapers behind it, every single one of them said October 10th and October 11th, 1898. And so we're looking at these walls that had not been touched. And then in the boys' room, someone had been playing barrel stencil practicing on the wall. Well, the thing is that the wall, all the barrels said D.H. Call's sour mash corn whiskey, whiskey spelled without an E. Well, in America, we add an E to it, but in Scotland, they do not. And so then we're looking at this and going, okay, well, this was originally, the person making this was coming from a Scotch background, a heritage out of Scotland. Okay, so we know that. But D.H. Call sour mash corn whiskey had never been registered with the revenuers, which means that they were running something before the time frame that the revenuer started collecting tax for it. So you have these 2 rooms that are an absolute time capsule that we now own. Now add that to the 313 acres that told so many stories. And so I do believe that a part of people wanting to be a part of telling the story is that we went in and we invested in the community immediately. We were there I was there every day. And so even when I had to travel back to Los Angeles, for the most part, I wouldn't ever be gone for longer than a few days. And people understood, okay, most people, she's not here to harm us. She's actually here to tell the side of the story that's the opposite of what the internet has spread, this rumor, this terrible rumor that has gone around the world like wildfire. If she proves what she said she's here to prove, then she gets to correct that story. In Lynchburg, Tennessee, that community, the name is redeemed. Jack's family, the name is redeemed. And so there was a lot of people who came to the table to help. I think because I was an outsider and I refused to listen to the advice of anyone who's been in the industry for a long time. And the reason I refused that advice is I said, this industry was built by all Americans, which at the time of the founding of our country, what you had the majority of are African Americans and white Americans. Yet somehow, once the story emerges, There's no African Americans who are a part of it. Then this liquor business is built in America, one of our biggest industries, one of our largest exports. And there was never, prior to Uncle Nearest Premium Whiskey, there was never a bottle that commemorated an African American. How's that possible? In the 400 years that we had been here and involved in this business, there had never been a single bottle. When we opened up Nearest Green Distillery here in Shelbyville, which is now the 7th most visited distillery in the world, when we opened that up, that was the first time ever a distillery had been named after an African American anywhere in the world. And so I do believe that me bringing together a bunch of outsiders and us looking at the industry differently allowed for us to not get ensnared in some of the traps that others that had come before us had. The fact that there had never been a successful spirit brand that had been created by a woman or a person of color. We represent 70% of this country, and not one of us was able to succeed at that. And so the question became, how do we do this different from everyone who came before us in order to succeed? And that's what we did. Probably the most rewarding thing is one of the things we set out to do was something that people said could not be done, which was when we came into the industry, every single bourbon company, every single one, marketed almost exclusively and entirely to white men. And they did that because by far, that was who the largest consumer base was, but it's also in part because every single story and every single brand that had been out up until that point were all white men. And so it would make sense that that's who they would market to. And I approached it very differently. I said, if we're making something that's good enough for white men, why is that not good enough for everyone? I want to market to everyone. And then everyone said, that's too expensive. You can't do that. I said, well, it might be too expensive, but I'd rather not leave anybody off the table. And so that's what we did. We went about the business of marketing to every single demographic that spends $50 on a bottle of whiskey, every single demographic. And now I would say the most proud thing for me is when I am at the distillery, and right now I'm at my home office, but when I'm at the distillery and I'm looking outside of the window and I'm seeing the tours, there's usually about 25 people on a tour, and there's usually 3 generations, every color under the sun, every political affiliation, every background, socioeconomic, geography, to see that on every single one of our tours. And for a lot of these people, they are in such silos in the communities in which they live in that it takes them a second to kind of double take, like, wait, we're all here? We're all here and appreciating the same exact thing? And we're all raising a glass and toasting to the exact same purpose? People would have you to believe that in America, that's not even possible, but at Nearest Green Distiller, it most certainly is. And then I do believe that those people then take that experience of this racial harmony and this coming together collectively to lift up one of our hidden figures of American history, and then they're taking that back to the bar with them. So then when they're sitting at a bar, they're asking the bartender, the beverage director, the people sitting at the bars, they're saying, hey, do you know the story of Uncle Nearest? And then they go into sharing the stories with such excitement that I am so enormously proud. I've had people actually tell me the story, having no idea who I am. And there's a bottle of Uncle Nearest, and I ask for a dram of it, and then someone will begin to tell me the story and say, do you know what you're drinking? And they'll say it with such excitement. And it's funny because most of the time, at some point in their story, they'll talk about the woman who uncovered it, and they have no idea that it's me. And so it's also a lot of fun to hear the excitement in the third person about you. Coming into it and seeing early success, we realized, my goodness, we're the only ones. We don't want to be the only ones. And we also saw so many African-American founders that were greatly struggling in this industry, and they still are. But we were able to say, listen, what can we help with? And we became the bat phone for at least 75% of African-American founders in this industry, where if they're trying to figure out, how do I raise capital, or how do I get this branding done? Or it might be legal, copyright issues, things of that nature. We're their bat phones. It's very rare for a day to go by where either I or someone on my leadership team is not helping out another African-American founder, another Black founder. And so that's the Black Business Booster Program, which is basically, we have really created a good amount of goodwill and political power within our industry. When we think about politics, we generally think about the White House and the Senate, but every industry has politics. And we have done a great job, I think, kind of moving around it and figuring out very quickly how this industry works, what doesn't work, how do you make it work for you? And then we share that with every Black founder who asks the question. So that's really the Black Business Booster Program, is taking everything that we have learned, everything that we know, every connection that we have, and very freely sharing that with others. The Uncle Nearest Ventures, that was and still is investing in other Black-owned, Black-founded brands that were not able to get the capital that they needed, but are incredible brands. Again, it's this notion of we pull as we climb. And it's a lot harder to climb when you are pulling weights with you. But I do believe that when you get to the top, if you have other people that are coming up right behind you, there is an element of that where you feel like you were part of a much bigger and more important story, which is to lift up other people.
What can your readers look forward to immersing themselves in next? Are you staying within this history and mining deeper, or heading off into a completely different direction entirely as an author?
It's here. We're still doing a great deal of research here. We also really dug into the story of cognac and why America has long been the #1 destination for that particular spirit. And then once you get into America, why more than about 75% of cognac is consumed by Black Americans and Black Latinos. Why? And so the story behind that is remarkable. We shot the short film with Jeffrey Wright not too long ago, and I can't wait for that story to come out next year, because #1, it's going to blow people's minds. But the ability to take very unique American stories that no one knows about and involves multiple races, that to me is so special, because for so long we've been almost wired to believe that every race has to sort of stay within their race, and that there isn't really true identity when you start mixing and mingling. And so to bring forth stories in which multiple races were involved in the success, I absolutely love that, because how I believe that America continues to grow and to dominate, to continue to be the world superpower, is within it, we have to figure out how to all come together. And so the stories in which we were already together are very helpful for giving us the blueprint on how to move that forward. And we lose our way a lot in this country. I think everyone does, but in this country, we have a very short memory. We lose our way. And so with all of the stories that come out about racial relations between Blacks and whites, and the negative to the positive, when you're talking about the 19th century or even the 20th century, that's on a 1,000,000-to-1 basis, right? And so I do believe that we need stories like this story, the story of cognac, to come forward to guide us, to give us hope, to show us that we did this before. We can do it again. And that's what the story of Love and Whiskey is. It's what the story of Uncle Nearest helps us to represent. And every story, I pray, every story that I write for all of my life will be in some way, shape, or form on love. Even if the big book is a business book, there is still an element of love that runs through that, because you can't convince me that any human being wants anything more than that.
Fawn, it has been impressive and educational talking today. Thank you so much for taking out time to be on About the Authors TV.
Thank you.